You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, Colin here with a quick note for you before we get into this episode. Last week I said that this was going to be a little bit of a lighter episode by comparison to some of the stuff we've talked about so far, and that is mostly true, I promise. But I forgot that we have to get through the first 3 verses of chapter 4 first. The first 3 verses are a little bit dark. They deal with topics like death and even suicide, and we are going to talk about that in the beginning of the episode here. So I wanted to give a content warning for that right up front. If talking through death and suicide is something that could trigger you, totally understand if you want to skip the first part of the episode. We will put the timestamps in the notes for the episode so you can just skip ahead if you would prefer. So just want to give you a heads up on that. Now, on to the episode. Chapter 4 builds on everything that Qoheleth brought in chapter 3, and that might not seem obvious right away, but the Net Bible points out that this section is closely related to the preceding, because Qoheleth's observation of oppression here in these first 3 verses links back to his previous observation about oppression and injustice in the places of righteousness and judgment from chapter 3 verse 16. It stands in stark contrast with his admonition for humans to enjoy life on earth as the reward for one's work in verse 22 of the previous chapter. Now he turns his attention to consider the sorry fate of those who are not able to enjoy life on earth and their work because of oppression, over obsessive competitiveness, and loneliness. End of quote. So there's your little outline for the beginning of this chapter, dealing with how oppression, over obsessive competitiveness, and loneliness can impair your ability to enjoy the good life that he thinks we should all have. So let's look at these first 3 verses. He says, "So I returned, and considered all the oppression that was done under the sun." Now, when you have this considered or perceived that shows up several times here in these chapters, it's just the word for see. So he's saying, I looked around, I saw all the oppression that was done under the sun. And look, behold, the tears of those who were oppressed, they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead, which are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive. Yea, better indeed is he than both of they, which has not yet been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. I can 100% guarantee you are not going to hear these verses preached from a church pulpit. This is not the sort of message that most Christians expect to get out of their Bible. You're looking for something devotional, something hopeful, the kind of thing that you would hear in church. You're not expecting to open up your Bible and hear, it's better to be dead than alive. In fact, it's better actually to have never been born. That's pretty shocking and even upsetting. We'll parse that out in a second here to talk about what exactly is going on with that. But first I want to get through a few grammatical notes of interest here in these verses. But while I'm going through that, I want you to think about how his statements here make you feel. I've kind of learned there's basically like 2 types of Christians, right? There's the type who is just okay with whatever is said in church. They're comfortable with it. They're happy with it. They'll say amen. Everything looks nice and squeaky clean on a Sunday. And then there's the type that doesn't really fit in with the narrative of a lot of American Christianity. They feel like they're on the fringe of the church. Even if they're there every service and helping out with a lot of things, they don't feel like they can truly be themselves amongst other Christians because the community just feels too fake. And they have these deeper issues and concerns and questions and feelings and doubts and frustrations that just don't seem welcome. I think if you fit into that first category, these 3 verses might really shock you as just feeling completely out of place in the mind of a Christian. Like, aren't we supposed to be in right out, right up, right down, right happy all the time? Aren't we supposed to have the joy of the Lord? What in the world is this doing in my Bible to say that it would be better to be dead than alive? But if you fit into the second category, which I'm guessing most of you who are listening do, because this sort of podcast tends to appeal to people who don't feel like they get enough out of church and they want a little bit more out of their Bible teaching. You might be a little more comfortable with this. It might still strike you as odd and a little upsetting, but you're going to be more attuned with what Qoheleth is saying. Maybe you've even experienced that at some point in your own life. And I just want to say up front, that is totally okay. I know that a lot of churches don't seem comfortable talking about that sort of thing. In fact, some churches even just preach so vehemently against suicide as being a mortal sin that you feel like you can't even talk about when you're a little depressed or upset without getting corrected or yelled at. So that's not what we're going for here at all. This perspective is in the Bible. Not just here. In fact, we're going to be talking about some other instances in just a minute here. So I want you to know, if this is something where you have ever felt this way, you are not alone. I have felt that way myself sometimes. If you have never experienced that level of depression in your life, I appreciate your listening to this, and I ask that you continue to, as long as it's not too upsetting for you. But I think it would help you to be able to hear this perspective from someone who has dealt with this sort of mindset in his own mind, whether he wanted it there or not. And you can start to understand better a significant section of the church, of your brothers and sisters in Christ who are all around you suffering in silence every week. Because there are absolutely people that you know who are good, solid, Bible-believing Christians who deal with this sort of thing. And a lot of times they just don't feel comfortable talking about it. So if you haven't dealt with that, I would encourage you to listen to this. Try to wrap your mind around it as best as you can. And it might be hard because it's just a different way of viewing life that nobody asks for, but some people have. And if it is something you deal with, thank you for listening as well. I hope I'm able to bring a little bit of voice, at least out of my own experience. I don't claim to speak for everyone who's ever had any depression by any means, but I think that this is a major, major topic that we need to make room to talk about in our churches and in Christianity as a whole. We need to stop demonizing it. We have to stop trying to label it as sin because the person isn't experiencing the joy of the Lord. Now, we need to realize that depression is something that can happen to anybody. It can happen to a good Christian. It is not sin-related. It is all throughout the Bible. It is all throughout life, and that is okay. All right, before we get more into that, I kind of want to break this up a little bit because I know it is heavier material. So let's look at just a few grammatical notes here in these few verses. First, when he talks about oppression, that is the word ashak in Hebrew. And it has the idea of causing hardship for another person. So when we just talk about oppression, that can seem very ethereal. It seems like the sort of thing you have in like a movie, the king oppresses his people or whatever. But sometimes we have a hard time bringing that into our own lives and saying, well, what does that mean for me? I just have this glorified, romanticized movie version of what someone oppressing another person looks like. What would that look like in day-to-day life? Well, it is just causing hardship for another person. It's doing something that makes life harder for another human being. That's a little more down to earth. That is something we all experience every day. That's what happens when someone cuts in front of you at the grocery line at the store, or when you do that to someone else, or in traffic, or the way that sometimes we treat our spouse or our children or our coworkers. Whenever we're saying me first over you, that is oppression. It's very similar to what the Bible Project has as their definition of sin. It's any time that I put me and my tribe over you and yours without thought for how it affects you and yours. See, it's not wrong to look out for yourself or to take care of your own family, but when we do that at the expense of other people, we are not living out the gospel message. This is something where there is no us versus them here. It is not us righteous people who are oppressed and those wicked people who do the oppressing. This is within the church. This is within Christianity. This is something that human beings do to each other every day. My choosing to do something that harms you without thought for that is oppression. Now, the opposite of that in this verse is comforter, and it comes from the root word nakam, which if you listen to our Genesis 1 through 6 series, you might remember Well, probably not. If you have an incredible mind for language, you might remember this. But yeah, as I started to say that, I'm like, you know what? You probably don't. You kind of have to be a major Hebrew nerd to appreciate this. But once I start talking about it, I think you'll remember. Episode 10, we talked through Genesis 5, and we mentioned how when Noah was born, his father Lamech, now remember there were two Lamechs, there was a bad Lamech and a good Lamech. A lot of English Bibles will say Lamech with an A, but in Hebrew it's actually with an E, Lamech. When Noah was born, his father Lamech said that he was going to bring rest, comfort to the world in response to the curse that had been there since the garden. And we go into more detail in that episode 10, about what exactly that means. But there's this odd play on words where he uses this word nakam for comfort or rest to play off of Noah's name in Hebrew, which is Noach. They are slightly different words, so it's a little bit of a weird play on words. It's not a one-for-one correlation, but there's definitely something going on there. So you have the name Noach and the word nakam that he brings. So Noach brings nakam. And so here we're kind of hyperlinking to the Noah story by saying that there is no nakam for these people, no comforter for the oppressed, no one to stand up and take the side of the less fortunate. Robert Alter says, it is notable that Qoheleth registers the suffering of the oppressed as a given fact, without the slightest indication, as in Psalms and elsewhere, that God will rescue them from their suffering, and without any exhortation, as in the prophets, that we must act to rescue them. End of quote. This is a really good point and something that I want to bring up here, because we've kind of been skirting this issue in the Ecclesiastes series so far, and it's about time that I take a minute and talk about this. The way a lot of us were taught to read the Bible is to imagine it as having a very univocal voice. In other words, there is one clear message, one clear speaker, one clear voice from Genesis through to Revelation. It is all one perspective. You can open the Bible anywhere, be it in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the prophets, the Gospels, the Torah, anywhere, and you are going to get the exact same perspective. That's just not accurate. Now, regardless of what your view of inspiration is and what role God played in the transmission of the Bible to humans, we have to acknowledge that he allowed the humans' perspectives and backgrounds and personalities to impact the writing. So there are different parts of the Bible that I wouldn't say they contradict each other. I don't like that word. It's too loaded. But they bring different perspectives. And different perspectives are okay. The Bible itself says that in the multitude of counselors there is wisdom, there is safety. Why? Because sometimes we need a perspective other than our own in order to better understand an issue. If you're in court and everybody's testimony matches up exactly right, you're assuming that there's some lying going on because people don't get every little detail exactly the same from person to person. If you're a teacher and all the students' answers are exactly the same word for word, you don't think, wow, they really got the material. You think, why are they cheating? We need a little bit of variation to see the full picture. That's okay. That is not threatening to the Bible to admit that. For crying out loud, we literally have 4 Gospels side by side that all give separate accounts of Jesus that focus on different aspects of his life and ministry. But we miss that because we blend them all together into this big mishmash harmony of the Gospels and think that we're doing justice to them by trying to get the bigger picture. Well, all that does is it smooths over the differences and causes us to miss the beautiful things that each Gospel writer was trying to say uniquely in their own voice. So I say all of that to say, as we get here to Qoheleth and we hear some of these different perspectives, like Alter just brought out, this is a different perspective on suffering than you would get reading the Psalms, which is a different perspective on suffering than you would get if you read the prophets. That should not concern us. That should not have us pulling our hair out and going, oh no, the Bible isn't inspired, this is trash, why are we reading this? No, it's the very fact that there are different perspectives in it that lend credence and value to it. Because we don't just go to the Bible to hear one voice. We go to the Bible to hear a community of voices and how they all relate to God and come to God and think about God. And once we realize that, it gives us permission to bring our different opinions and thoughts and beliefs about God into the mix. Rather than trying to all have the exact same opinion, we can try to learn from each other and get a fuller picture. So if you were to read the Psalms, you would get this perspective that there is a lot of suffering in the world. The world is messed up. There's a lot of hurt, but God is in control. He's going to take care of it. At least in most of them. There are a few that come at from a little bit of a different angle, more like Qoheleth. Psalm 88 is one of those. It's actually one of my favorite psalms just because it's so different from the rest. If you can't tell by now, I kind of have a little bit of a darker sense of humor, almost a little bit of a goth personality, I guess. I've always liked more macabre things. So I like talking about these topics that don't often get talked about in church. And if you're listening, I guess you do too. But yeah, the Psalms are kind of going to be your stereotypical, like, church perspective on suffering. It's out there, but one day God's going to make it right. The prophets, on the other hand, bring a call to action. They're very interested in social justice, if I can use that buzz term. I probably shouldn't because it has a lot of baggage, but I did, so there. They're very interested in how we can be the ones to bring about change to the injustice that happens in the world. And then Qoheleth kind of has this, I don't even know if it's an in-between perspective. I guess it's a little more extreme than either of those. He's more just almost fatalistic about it. He's like, yeah, there's suffering, there's oppression in the world, and no one's doing anything about it, so we just have to realize it's there. Those are three very different perspectives on suffering and oppression. Which one is right? Yes and no. They all have an upside, if I can put it that way, and they all have a downside. And it's in the connection of all three of them together, the consideration of all of them together, that we're able to get a more holistic view on oppression and what our role in it is. We have to consider that the upside of the psalmist's views are that we have hope of something getting better one day. Even if we don't see it there today, it's going to get better one day. The downside to that, and this is what I grew up with, is you just end up having people saying, well, God will take care of it, and we have to wait on his time. And then what happened is people just didn't act. They didn't take opportunities to speak out against injustice because they were just waiting for God to do something. And really, I think God was there waiting for us to do something all along. Qoheleth's view is very realist. It's not idealist. You get like the social justice sort of person who just thinks we can change the world in our generation. And Qoheleth is like, no, you can't. You might make a little bit of difference, but at the end of the day, oppression is still going to be there as long as there are humans. We are going to continue to screw things up. So the good thing with his view is he doesn't have his head in the clouds. He's very down to earth about it. He's accepted the reality of life. We talk about acceptance being the first step to moving forward in just about anything. You have to accept that life is screwed up sometimes. The downside is, yet again, it can cause you to feel no pressure to act, because if this is just going to continue, what does my little bit do? It's not worth my doing anything. Problem with that is that, yeah, your little bit might not make a huge difference, but if everybody says that, then no difference is made. If everybody says my little difference might make a bigger difference, then as a collective, it does. My picking up a piece of trash off of the ground, or letting someone go in front of me at the grocery store, or while I'm driving, or something like that, it might not make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. But if everybody picked up some trash when they saw it, and everybody was willing to let someone go in front of them, the world might be a little bit of a cleaner, friendlier place. So that's the problem with Qoheleth's view, is it kind of leads us to think, well, I can't make a huge difference, so why make a small difference? And that's kind of true, but if a bunch of people make a small difference, it becomes a huge difference. And that's where I'm really intrigued now by the prophets' perspective. This is something I'd like to get into eventually on the podcast, but I have to admit, the prophets have always been my weak point in Bible interpretation. I have spent all kinds of time in the first 5 books, all kinds of time in the Gospels, the Epistles, Revelation, Psalms, Proverbs, we're here in Ecclesiastes now, but I never really heard preaching out of the prophets growing up. And I guess part of that's because it doesn't really lend itself to the same kind of good, clean storytelling as some other parts. It's not as much a narrative, aside from maybe Jonah. Jonah always got picked out. Classic VeggieTales movie and the flannel graphs and everything that comes with that. But I think the only times we really talked about any prophet other than Jonah would be, Isaiah gets pulled out around Christmas for those couple of passages that get applied to Jesus. And the church that I grew up in was very heavy on preaching about tithing and giving. So without fail, at least once a year, we'd end up in Malachi about bringing tithes into the storehouse. But we never really talked about the prophets that much. And I think part of it, aside from just how confusing some of their message can be in our context, since we don't know theirs, is because they talk about social justice. And my circles growing up did not like that. That was seen as liberal, progressive. That's the stuff that we don't do. That's the stuff that the liberals do. That's the stuff that the Democrats are interested in, right? But the fact of the matter is, it is in the Bible, and it is a big theme in the Bible that if the powerful oppress the powerless, it is the job of anyone with any power to protect the powerless. And again, I realize that we kind of romanticize all of that and it feels far off. Like, how can I apply that in my own life? Well, I'll tell you how. If you see someone taking advantage of someone else, if you see someone being emotionally or spiritually or physically abusive or manipulative or gaslighting or lying, call them out on their BS. The reason there is so much oppression and abuse in the world is because more people don't speak up about it. Now, are we going to absolutely change the world to be perfect in our generation? No, that will never happen. But maybe we can make it a little better for this generation and the ones after. Now, it's worth noting as a tangent here that many scholars actually see these 3 verses as evidence that Qoheleth is not Solomon. Now, you can go back to our first 2 episodes in this series to talk about the whole discussion of whether or not Qoheleth is Solomon, who he is. A lot of Christians think he is. Most scholars don't think he is. I'm pretty convinced he is not. And one of the arguments against his being Solomon is that these verses talk about his seeing oppression and saying no one does anything about it. Well, if he's King Solomon, he is the most powerful person in the land with enough resources to remedy the problem, or at least to start to remedy the problem. But Qoheleth does nothing about it. He sees himself as powerless to make any difference here in this verse as well. And from the rest of the scriptural testimony of Solomon's life story, we find that he actually increased the people's oppression toward the end of his reign. So it really does not seem to fit with Solomon to have him saying these words. So it's quite possible that this indicates Qoheleth was not Solomon. Rather, he was just taking on a Solomonly mantle that he has already kind of dropped by this point. There are a few translations that drop the very end of this verse, the second time that he says, but they had no comforter. And a lot of times it's people saying, well, he said that just a minute ago, so why would he be repeating himself? It must be a scribal mistake that it was put there twice. But more recently, scholars are starting to notice that Qoheleth has this very repetitive pattern throughout his writing. So there are other times where he repeats things in close proximity, and it's kind of a play on the cycles of life that we had at the beginning of chapter 3, showing how life really just kind of repeats itself. It goes in circles a lot of times. So it seems likely that this repetition of there being no comforter twice in verse 1 is there purposefully to kind of get you feeling just how helpless a person can feel when there is no one to stand up for them. In verse 3, the evil work done under the sun does not necessarily mean evil things. It's not saying that he saw evil things being done. Throughout Ecclesiastes, he has been using this term evil to talk about the way that God has set us up in life to work our whole lives and not make a huge difference. And he accuses God of doing something that is evil. So this is talking about the hevel that we deal with in our work, where we don't actually accomplish anything super meaningful at the end of our lives. Most of us will never get even a sentence in the history books. And that can be kind of depressing, but Qoheleth actually says it's a good thing for us to realize that, because then that allows us to stop grasping for this delusion of grandeur that is out of our control, and instead accept the little blessings of the life that we have. Now remember, Qoheleth is just doing all kinds of thought experiments here. He is trying to figure out, is there anything in life that actually lasts? And in the first couple of chapters he says, no, it's all gone by the time you breathe your last breath. So what is the most beneficial thing to do? And now he's just kind of been going to the extreme of every possible path, following it out, then walking the path back, going down the next path, walking that one all the way out, coming back, walking down the next one. So he's following these out to their extremes. He's not necessarily endorsing every view that he takes, but rather he's just trying to point out the shortcomings of each one. So content warning again here, as we're going to talk a little bit more about death and suicide. Again, we'll put the time signatures right there in the episode, so if this is something that upsets you, you're able to skip ahead. But moving forward now into this, Qoheleth actually says it would be better to be dead than to be alive. And in fact, it would be better never even to be born. Now, this is very closely tied to what he observed in verse 1. The suffering, the oppression that he saw in the world, that can lead for a desire for all of it to end. This is very real and needs to be talked about. It's something that not a lot of Christians are comfortable with. So we kind of keep it at arm's length in our churches. We push it to the borders. But it's something that a lot more people than you might think at some point in their lives, or they deal with. Rabbi Rami Shapiro in the Ecclesiastes annotated and explained commentary kind of puts a helpful spin on this. He says, death itself is not the problem. The dead have no problems. The problem is that you aren't dead yet. You are alive, and life is the problem. Life lived in the shadow of eternity, under the illusion of immortality. This is the problem. You live, and you want to live forever, but you can't. Different religions offer hope in different ways. Reincarnation and eternal life in heaven or hell are the two most common ways of escaping death. It doesn't really matter which you prefer, since both offer you the illusion of an undying I, an I that you can claim is you. End of quote. So he seems to be taking a view that's almost similar to what Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell would say about the death of the ego. And it's kind of this journey that a person has to go on where they, if I can put it in Christian terms, die to self. You kind of crucify your own image of yourself, your own ego, and you come out with less baggage, less expectation in life. That's not something that everybody recovers from. Once you start going down this path of wondering about what is actually my place in life, what is my meaning, what is my purpose, why am I even here? Should I even be here? That can become a dark spiral for a lot of people. And we're kind of towing that line here. So that's why I wanted to give the content warnings up front. And you might know that this is a very different picture of death than we have in some of the verses in the New Testament that we like to focus on. Like the main one that came to my mind is Paul saying, "O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory?" The sting of death is sin, the strength of sin is the law, I think he says. So that's kind of descriptive, representative, I guess I should say it's representative of this bigger picture in the New Testament where death is seen as a final enemy that has to be conquered. I mean, heck, at the end of Revelation, there's even saying that death and hell are cast into the lake of fire. So we have death put up as this enemy that is going to conquer us, but through Jesus, we get to conquer it. And so a lot of Christians have this view of death, that it is bad. We have to euphemize it, right? We don't say that a Christian has died. We say that they have passed on. We don't have a funeral for them. We have a celebration of life. Now, I realize that's not true of all traditions, but in the one that I grew up in, that is the sort of language that was used. We euphemized death because we didn't like it. We were scared of it, but we didn't want to admit we were scared of it. We wanted to say we have hope in Christ, so let's just pretend that death isn't really even a thing because now they're just happy in heaven. And that is one perspective you can take, and if that helps you, that's fine. But other portions of the Bible don't present death as an enemy, but as a natural part of life. Sure, maybe it was not originally a part of God's plan in the garden for humans to die, but we are not in the garden. And without death, there cannot continue to be life. If you did not have death, we would have overpopulated the earth a long time ago. If animals didn't die, there would be no room for us humans. If plants didn't die, there would be no fertilization of the ground, right? We need there to be death in order for there to be life. I mean, this is even in the 4 seasons. You need the death of fall and winter to move into the life of spring and summer. Without one, you can't have the other. We like to focus on the nice, clean things, but the darker, sadder part of life also needs to be there. They have to exist in tension with each other. That is a Christian view too. We don't have to just write off death. We can acknowledge that it's there, talk about it, be real about it. I think that would actually be more honest and more helpful. So I'd love to hear from you on this. Was that your experience in church similar to mine, where you kind of euphemized death? Or did you come from a tradition that was more accepting of it and more holistic, saw it as a natural part of life? What do you think of it now? What different perspectives on it do you find in the Bible? I would love to hear from you about it. Well, since we're talking about it here in the Bible, let's give some examples of this. And let's specifically talk about what Qoheleth is possibly saying here. Scholars will argue whether or not he actually believes this, but what he is saying about thinking it would be better to never be born is very similar to a belief that is called anti-natalism. In natal, you kind of hear the word for baby, so we have anti-natalism, the belief that humans should not have children. When you think about it, and this is going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, so stay with me, none of us chooses to be born. And it's kind of presumptuous to assume that we would all want this. You know, if you could imagine if every soul had the opportunity before life to choose if they actually wanted to do this, would all of them say yes, not knowing what would happen? Or what if you could know what would happen, the good and the bad? Would you still say yes to it? I mean, sure, life can have some fantastic times, but it can also have so much pain that you can have a rational, good, spiritual person want to end it all. To have children is to purposefully thrust on a human a lifetime of loss and suffering that they would never have had to experience otherwise, and that they never got the choice to say, yeah, I'd like to experience that. Now, I know this kind of gets into some dark thoughts here, and if you've never thought down this path before, it can be really scary. So I'm here with you to guide you through this. We're not going to be here too long, but we do need to talk about this because as jarring and minority a view as this may appear to be, it actually has ancient roots. It shows up not just here in Ecclesiastes, but in the much earlier book of Job. This is not a one-off in your Bibles. In fact, I realize this is a little bit long here, but I want to read you chapter 3 of the book of Job, just to give you a feel that this is not solely Qoheleth speaking here. So this is chapter 3 of Job, and it reads, "At last Job spoke, and he cursed the day of his birth. He said, 'Let the day of my birth be erased, and the night I was conceived. Let that day be turned to darkness. Let it be lost even to God on high, and let no light shine on it. Let the darkness and the utter gloom claim that day for its own. Let a black cloud overshadow it. Let the darkness terrify it. Let that night be blotted off the calendar, never again to be counted among the days of the year, never again to appear among the months. Let that night be childless. Let it have no joy. Let those who are experts at cursing, whose curse could rouse Leviathan." Oh boy, what a Genesis reference right there. Don't have time for it. "Let them curse that day. Let its morning stars remain dark. Let it hope for light, but in vain. May it never see the morning light. Curse that day for failing to shut my mother's womb, for letting me be born to see all of this trouble. Why wasn't I born dead? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? Why was I laid on my mother's lap? Why did she nurse me at her breasts? Had I died at birth, I'd now be at peace. I'd be asleep and at rest. I would rest with the world's kings and prime ministers whose great buildings now lie in ruins. I would rest with princes rich in gold, whose palaces filled with silver. Why wasn't I buried like a stillborn child, like a baby who never lives to see the light? For in death the wicked cause no trouble, and the weary are at rest. Even captives are at ease in death, with no guards to curse them. Rich and poor are both there, and the slave is free from his master. Oh, why give glory to those in misery, and life to those who are bitter? They long for death, but it won't come. They search for death more eagerly than for hidden treasure. They're filled with joy when they finally die, and rejoice when they find the grave. Why is life given to those with no future, those God has surrounded with difficulties? I can't eat for sighing. My groans pour out like water. What I have always feared has happened to me. What I dreaded came true. I have no peace, no quietness, no rest, only trouble." The prophet Jeremiah expressed similar thoughts in chapter 20, verses 14 and following. He says, "Cursed be the day where I was born. Don't let the day wherein my mother bore me be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought tidings to my father, saying, a man-child is born to you. Make him very glad. And let that man be as the cities which Yahweh overthrew and didn't repent. Let him hear the cry in the morning and the shouting at noontide, because he didn't kill me from the womb. Or that my mother might have been my grave, her womb to have always been great with me. Why did I come out of the womb to see labor and sorrow, that my days would be consumed with shame? See, Job's desire for death arose from his own sufferings, Jeremiah as well, and a little bit from seeing his people suffer. Qoheleth generalizes that sentiment based on the rampant suffering he sees around him. The apocryphal book of Sirach says, O death, how welcome is your sentence to one who is needy and failing in strength, worn down by age and anxious about everything, to one who is contrary and has lost all patience. Uncut pointed out that the schools of Hillel and Shammai, two rabbinical schools in the intertestamental period in between the Old and New Testaments, could not agree on whether the book of Ecclesiastes should be included in the biblical canon, but both of them agreed that it was better never to be born than to be born. Around the same time that Ecclesiastes was being written, Sophocles, the Greek philosopher, wrote, not to be born is, beyond all estimation, best. But when a man has seen the light of day, this is next best by far, that with utmost speed he should go back from where he came. For when he has seen youth go by, with its easy merrymaking, what hard affliction is foreign to him? What suffering does he not know? Envy, faction, strife, battles, murders. Last of all falls to his old lot, age, blamed, weak, unsociable, friendless, wherein dwells every misery among miseries. Ouch. Shortly after Jesus, Seneca wrote, nothing is so deceptive, nothing so treacherous as human life. By Hercules, were it not given to men before they could form an opinion, no one would take it. Not to be born, therefore, is the happiest lot of all. Believe it or not, this view is even present in some early Christian writings. Augustine said, but I am aware of some that murmur, what, say they, if all men shall abstain from all sexual intercourse, whence will the human race exist? Would that all would do this, only in charity out of a pure heart, and good conscience, and faith unfeigned. Much more speedily would the city of God be filled, and the end of the world hastened. End of quote. Basically, he's saying if people stopped having kids, God's kingdom would come about faster because we would stop having more people. Likewise, Gregory of Nyssa praised the celibate as those who, quote, bring about a cancellation of death by preventing it from advancing further because of them, and by setting themselves up as a kind of boundary stone between life and death, they keep death from going forward. End of quote. That's a lot to take in. When I was doing the study for this episode, I could not believe the number of quotations I found of people espousing some form of antinatalism within the time of the biblical world. It's just something I was not even familiar with, and it kind of blew my mind. So let's talk about this for a second. Since we can't go back in time and prevent ourselves from being born, what can we do with this life that we never asked for? Well, your options basically remain as either A, suicide, or B, making the most of life. And I don't mean to make light of this here. Those are actually the choices. And there is a whole philosophical debate about the issue of suicide. And once you can settle for yourself in your own mind the answer to the question of whether or not life is worth living, that's kind of like the core question. And then you just move on with life. Now, opinions on suicide were mixed and controversial in the ancient world, just as they are today. In most cases, people back then would have seen it as cowardly, though some exceptions could be made depending on the circumstances, and it would be considered appropriate. The Bible actually nowhere specifically condemns or condones suicide. Both of those statements might surprise our listeners, especially if you came from maybe more of a Catholic tradition where you heard that suicide was a mortal sin, send you straight to hell. That is nowhere in the Bible. That's in later tradition, and it's kind of tied to Judas' death because he is one of the more popular suicides in the Bible. And since a lot of people just automatically assume Judas must have gone to hell, they equate suicide and hell. But if you really think that's the thing that would send Judas to hell out of everything that he did, I don't think so. And there's nothing else in the Bible to suggest that sort of thing. The Bible doesn't really talk in moral tones about suicide, either in favor of or completely against. 4 people in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, kill themselves. You have a little bit of debate, but basically these four are agreed upon. The first one is Samson in Judges, when he pushes down the temple of the Philistines over his head. Possibly Saul and his armor bearer, depending on which account you read. That kind of goes back to having the different perspectives on the Bible. There are actually two accounts of Saul's death, one in which he is killed, one in which he commits suicide. So it kind of depends on which version you think is more accurate there. That's another issue for another day. There is Ahithophel. During the time of David's reign, he was an advisor to King David, but he went along with a coup that was led by David's son Absalom, and in the whole mess of trying to dethrone David, he killed himself. It's actually a little bit of a sketchy situation. I'm thinking that probably back then there was the equivalent of Ahithophel didn't kill himself memes, but, that's just me. We haven't found any evidence of that yet. And then there's Zimri. Zimri was a later king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and when he was invaded by Omri, he decided to commit suicide by burning himself alive rather than surrendering to Omri. So those are the four-ish instances in the Tanakh, and then there is one main one in the New Testament, and that is Judas. There are a few others who exhibit suicidal tendencies throughout the Bible. You have Avimelech, often called Abimelech, in the book of Judges. He was one of Gideon's children, and he asks someone else to kill him, and they do. You have Job, who is suicidal at parts in his story, Elijah, who is suicidal, Jonah, arguably even Jesus, and possibly others. So this is not just some modern issue. This is something that people all throughout history deal with. Normal people can have periods like this in life. It's interesting, though, that whenever a person in the Bible asked God for death, he never provides it to them. He always treats them gently and gives them strength to continue on. And even Qoheleth never seems to fully cross the line into antinatalism. Ultimately, I think two things are worth noting here. One, Qoheleth makes room for these views. He talks about them. So we should make room for them too. It is okay to go through periods in life where you experience depression and even suicidal tendencies. And if that is something that you have dealt with, there is help and there is hope moving forward. But like Qoheleth himself would say, that's not necessarily in the cheesy, hallmarky kind of answers you might get from a church. Really, what he says is it comes down to just enjoying the little things in life in front of you. That's kind of like Qoheleth's prescription for when you feel really down on life, is to just find the little things that you can try to enjoy and get the most out of. And that's not saying it will totally cure clinical depression. Sometimes medication is needed. But it's also true that sometimes if we can just focus purposefully on the tiniest little good things in life, time with a friend or a family member, a good meal, a good drink, some satisfaction from work, that can redirect our focus into something more holistic. Not the in right, out right, up right, down right, cheesy veneer that you get in a lot of Christians, but something real. It might not look as fancy and clean and nice as that veneer, but it's more honest. And if I had to choose, I would rather deal with all the hardships of an honest life than to pretend that that isn't how I feel so I can be accepted by others. Moving into verse 4, we start to talk about work. And he says, "Again, I considered all the travail." And that word travail is the word he has used before to refer to anxiety-inducing work. It's the Hebrew word amal. And the King James here says right work. The Hebrew is kisharon ma'asah. And I guess it's because kisharon can mean beneficial that they said right work, but really a better translation would be to say skillful work. It's the things that you are uniquely good at doing. So I saw all of the anxiety-inducing work. I saw all of the skilled work that people do. And it is all for a man to be envied of his neighbor. This is vanity and vexation of spirit. Now, neighbor can mean anything from friend to lover. So it doesn't necessarily mean the person living right next to you. It refers to someone within your circle of acquaintances, your friends, your family, somebody that you know. Shapiro says, "There is no escape from the necessity of labor. You need to eat. So you have to work. But why work beyond what is required for a decent life? Why allow work to push everything else to the margins? Qoheleth says it is envy that drives us. Think about that. Does capitalism work when envy is absent? If you don't crave more, would you work less? See, the answer is moderation. Work just enough to find joy in what you do and what good it brings you. Then stop. Enslaved to work, you have no time for family and friends. And without these, there's no one to share the bounty of your efforts. So your success becomes hollow. Perhaps you excuse your obsession with work by claiming that you are laboring not for yourself, but for your dependents. You work so that your children will have a better life than you have. Qoheleth has already told you in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, however, that that is absurd, seeing as you can't know for certain that your heirs will appreciate their inheritance or use it wisely. But even more absurd are those who labor endlessly without dependents or heirs. Work is not an end, but a means, and the end isn't to amass more than you can use, but to earn just enough to meet your basic needs, leaving as much time as possible for friends and family. End of quote. NASB, the New American Standard Bible, does a good job with this verse. They translated it, "I have seen that every labor and every skill that is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after wind." The Good News Bible says that this is why we strive so hard to succeed in life. Really, we just want to look good in the eyes of someone else. We're trying to impress other people, be they peers or parents. See, so much of what we do in life is really just to gain the approval of others, be that parents, employers, friends. We all live enslaved to other people who don't really care that much about what we do, and definitely don't have the right to tell us what to do. But this is the human plight. We work and we strive and we keep going up the corporate ladder just to keep up with the Joneses. We work harder to make more money, to put improvements on the house, or to put our kids in a better school, or to get a better car, or to go on better vacations so we can post better pictures on Facebook, whatever it is. The whole thing is just keeping up with the Joneses. And Qoheleth says that's hevel. Why are you trying to impress people who don't really matter in the grand scheme of things? That's not to say that the people around you are unimportant, but it is to say that they don't get to judge your life. They're not the ones who are going to stand at the end of your life, look over all of your Facebook pictures and decide whether or not you had a good life. So why are you trying to base your entire existence around what they have done and whether or not you can top it? I am not one of those preachers who is going to preach against social media all the time. I think that it has its uses and it can be appropriate, and that's fine. But it is something that has really fed into this unhealthy side of humanity. It has fed our desire for approval from other people. And so we just keep shouting our lives into the void and hoping that somebody else will be impressed by us. And a lot of times, without trying to get too psychological here, it actually goes back to our childhood and when we were trying to impress mom or dad, or maybe a big brother or sister, and that drive for their acceptance, or perhaps inversely, to avoid their rejectance, is what keeps a lot of people going even into adulthood. And we have to realize that what we're striving for is already decades in the past. Whether or not we achieved it back then is a different issue, and that's a matter for a therapist. But we have to stop trying to please people who aren't us. We have to live our lives, nobody else. I just saw something this past week on social media. See, social media does have good uses, where somebody said that people try too hard to be a good descendant when they should be trying harder to be a good ancestor. In other words, we are trying too hard to please our parents and our grandparents and the people around us, when really we should just be trying to make the best life for those who come after us. Very few people ever actually feel like they have the approval of their parents. So Qoheleth is kind of chipping away at that and saying, why are you trying so hard to get something that you don't actually have control over? They have to decide how they will treat you. You only decide whether or not you will accept yourself. That can be a really hard message to come to grips with, especially if you came from a high control religion that taught you not to think about yourself and your own needs. But it is so important. If you cannot accept yourself, you cannot accept others. If you find yourself struggling with other people, it might be because you have not yet come to terms with what is inside of you. We have to be okay with us before we can be okay with others. And that's what Qoheleth is saying. Verses 5 and 6 are kind of their own little thing. They don't quite fit with the rest, but they are slightly connected. And I will put a quote from Seeing What Qoheleth Saw by Douglas Fife in the notes that goes into why he thinks this is here purposefully, basically to get us to pause and wonder why it's here. So Qoheleth makes kind of a sharp transition in order for us to go back and reread what we just read and get us thinking about this again. Let me read these two verses for you. Verse 5, "The fool folds his hands together and eats his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit." I love how the Bible Project presented this in their Meditations podcast. It was during COVID. They had this secondary podcast that did little devotionals kind of explaining the books of the Bible. And on their one on Ecclesiastes, they presented these couple verses as 3 lifestyles you can choose from. The first is you can have folded arms, where you're lazy, you're dead to the world, you have given up, you're very cynical. Say, I'm an island unto myself. Second is that you can have closed fists. This is someone who is busy. You don't have enough time to do anything. You're just rushing from one thing to another, and you're missing out on the beauty of life around you because you're just going until your next task. And the third way is to have open palms to whatever God has for you. The folded arms, lazy lifestyle is just kind of the extreme version of the que sera, sera. Whatever happens, happens. I'm not in control of any of this, so I'm just going to give up. That doesn't get you anywhere, and it doesn't get you any friends. The working hard, just constantly moving lifestyle, it's praised in our culture, and apparently it was something in his too, because he talks about it. But it causes you to miss out on so much of life. And then the third option, what he recommends, is having this one hand full, but with, and the King James says quietness. Really that means having enough and resting satisfied without feeling like you need to get more. Shapiro translates it as better to work a little in joy than to be obsessed with work at the expense of tranquility. Sometimes having a simple life is better than having a lot going on. I live on the East Coast. We're pretty close to Philadelphia, and it's a very busy, bustling city. I love being there. I love having stuff to do. My wife could tell you, I fill up our calendar pretty full. We're constantly going here and there and traveling to see friends or going out for one event or another. And that's fun and it's great, but it's so easy to just end up rushing from one thing to another and missing out on so much because we're just trying to get to the next event. And then Qoheleth is calling to people like me who kind of have that 2 hands full lifestyle to say, why are you grasping for this? What are you trying to get? You're missing out. Slow down, pause, breathe, take some stuff off of your calendar, cancel some meetings, delete some stuff, and just enjoy what you have. Keep moving forward, but maybe at a 6 instead of an 11. The Interpretation Bible Commentary notes that according to ancient Near Eastern myth, the lack of rest and quiet leads only to chaos and tragedy. This can be found in Atrahasis and Enuma Elish, 2 ancient Mesopotamian works that we've talked about before. The value of rest and refreshment also holds a preeminent position in Qoheleth's view. If all-consuming work is the bane of human existence, rest constitutes humanity's redemption within the day-to-day of routine living. The sage's insight adds an important anthropological dimension to the theology of Sabbath rest. Unremitting work is the hallmark of oppression, a dramatic example of which can be found in the story of Israel's experience in Egypt. For Qoheleth, an individual's incessant drive to work, even for his or her self-enrichment, is no different from the oppression wielded by a ruthless taskmaster. Power can be wielded against oneself as easily as it can be used against a neighbor or an enemy. Without the benefit of rest, even self-employment is self-enslavement. End of quote. Wow, they put that fantastically, and even just reading it right now, it kind of hit me again. They're using Qoheleth's words to draw on the story of the Exodus and the way the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. That is oppression. They were oppressed under Pharaoh. But kind of spiritualizing it, we do the same things to ourselves. We create these self-inflicted schedules where we are our own taskmasters, and we almost oppress ourselves without giving ourselves rest. We've thought that busyness is next to godliness. And if we sit and rest, well, who's going to be dealing with this? And I need to take care of this and that, and I just need to be doing this. And taking a second to rest is tapping into Sabbath. It's realizing that the creation is not 6 days, but 7. We have to include time to rest in our schedule. Even God himself did that. He stepped back and he said, the world will continue if I take a day off. If God can say that, I think we can too. In an old series on Ecclesiastes, back when Tim Mackey from the Bible Project was pastoring at a church, he compared our work to building castles in the sand. The more you pour yourself into your work, the more stressed you become. Think about the person who owns a small business. That's the American dream, right? We're trying to be our own boss, make our own schedule, and make a lot of money as the business owner. Well, yes, you're doing what you love, but you're more stressed than the person who just clocks in and out of their 9 to 5 because you have all the extra responsibility of owning a business. The spirit of competition that we have with other people, the American dream, is really just our fighting for our own identities. You and I are trying to prove that we're worth taking up space in the universe, but that's hevel, because work can't give you value. See, this is a problem that so many people run into, where they treat their job as their identity, and then something happens, maybe an illness, or they're let go, or they just get old enough to retire from the job, and then they struggle with, who am I when I have based my entire identity around this thing I've been doing for the last 20, 30, 40 years? Realize that Qoheleth is not against work, right? He said that laziness, that folding your arms mentality is not good, but constantly grabbing, workaholism in our modern terminology, is no better than laziness. It's instead better to just keep one hand open, rather than folding both and doing nothing with them, rather than trying to grab and climb up the corporate ladder with both. Just work with one and rest with the other. A one-handed life is more balanced. You can be in a place of rest while working. You begin from a place of rest and proceed moving forward, doing what you have to survive, but acknowledging that you can't and won't try to control the outcome. Mackey compared it to a quote from Madonna. At one point she said, "I have so many regrets." And I have none. I wish I hadn't done a lot of things, but on the other hand, if I hadn't, I wouldn't be here. But then again, nobody works the way I work. I have an iron will. And all of my will has always been to conquer some horrible feelings of inadequacy. I'm always struggling with that fear. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being. And then I get to another stage and think I'm mediocre and uninteresting. I find a way to get myself out of that again and again. My drive in life is from this horrible fear of being mediocre. And that's always pushing me, because even though I've become somebody, I still have to prove that somebody. My struggle has never ended, and it probably never will. So many of us mirror Madonna's endless drive to prove herself. You'd think that someone who had achieved her level of fame and success would no longer have to prove themselves. But success and fame are fickle. They're like a Sisyphean venture where you're trying to push the rock up the side of the mountain and it just keeps rolling backwards. And drawing off of Mackey's work, I think this is where Matthew 11 and Jesus' words cap off this idea really well. Because Jesus responds to this mindset and says, "Come to me, everyone who labors and is heavy burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, because I am meek and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Note that Jesus never said, "I'm going to keep you from working. I'm going to give you time off." He has said that the work is going to be restful. Those two things don't seem to go together in our minds, and this doesn't make sense unless you view work and rest in light of Genesis 1. We have to remember Creation was not a 6-day thing. It was a 7-day thing. It all led up to the rest of God. Not a nap, but a resting in the balanced, synergistic unity between work and pleasure that God oversaw for the rest of time. You can go back to our Genesis 1 through 6 series where I talk about the week of creation never ended. The 7th day never ended. Days 1 through 6, you get evening and morning were the 6th day, the 5th day, the 4th day, whatever. But you never get down day 7. Why? Because God's Sabbath rest never ends. That doesn't mean he has been napping the whole time. He's still working, but while resting. And he invites us to do the same. And I think that's even what Jesus was inviting us into, and even what Qoheleth was trying to scratch the surface of. They're not saying that all of your troubles will go away. They're teaching you to live in the moment and to enjoy yourself. There is no promise to remove the labor or the burdens. Rather, the promise is to teach you to make the most out of the life that you have. See, this frees us from the tyranny of work. We don't have to be at the top of the ladder. We can just work the best that we can where we are. How? Well, do your best where you are and realize that the best you can do is the best you can do. And maybe do a little bit on the side to try to make everybody else's life around you a little better too. And if your work is not making people's lives better, maybe you're in the wrong line of work. Or maybe you're just viewing your work incorrectly and need to take a pause and view it from a different angle. The invitation of both Qoheleth and Jesus is to find rest in our work. Moving into verse 7, we start a new theme of both the value and hevel of relationships. So let me read these verses. Qoheleth says, I returned and I saw hevel under the sun. There is a person alone and not a second one. He has neither a child nor a brother, but there's no end to his work. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches, neither does he say, for whom do I labor, and bereave my soul of good? This is hevel. It is sore travail, an evil business. 2 are better than 1, because they have good reward for their labor. If they fall, they'll lift one up, his fellow, but woe to the man who is alone when he falls, because he doesn't have anyone to help him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 will withstand him, and a 3-fold cord is not easily broken. I'm going to pause there, because then he goes into a little bit of a story we'll get to in a second. Now, if we look in verse 8, if you're using a version that italicizes extra words added for clarity, you might notice that he says are in italics. In the King James, it's saith he. This is at the end of the verse. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor. That's in italics, and that means it's not there in Hebrew. It was supplied by the translators for clarity. However, by so doing, and this isn't just a King James thing, almost every translation I could find adds something along the lines of he said there. They are trying to explain the sudden shift to first person. But in so doing, I think they are glossing over what Qoheleth is possibly saying here. It almost seems like he is identifying himself with this person. Because if we just read this without the italics, it says there is a person who is alone and there's not a second one. He doesn't have a child or a brother, yet he doesn't stop working. His eye is not satisfied with riches. Who am I working so hard for? And bereaving my soul of good. This is hevel and sore travail. Do you see the difference? It's like he just automatically switches from talking in third person to talking in first person. It's like he is identifying himself with this man who is working so hard his whole life and losing out on all these other relationships and moments to share with people. Given the Solomonic persona he takes, I think that says a lot about the value of quality over quantity in relationships. Because if he's trying to take on the Solomonic persona, Solomon had countless wives, children, attendants, and yet here he is saying, who am I doing all this for? I have no one to share it with. The Good News Bible reads, here is a man who lives alone. He has no son, no brother, yet he's always working, never satisfied with the wealth he has. For whom is he working so hard and denying himself any pleasure? This is useless and a miserable way to live. See, relationships are hard work, and sometimes people forego them in order to focus on a career. This could be someone who has given up everything for his job to climb the corporate ladder, or maybe for a cause, perhaps even for a ministry. In the tradition I grew up in, it was seen as noble if you had someone who was willing to be single their whole lives, to be maybe a missionary for God or an evangelist or something like that. You really couldn't be a pastor most of the time being single. They didn't like that. But, if you put off all of these other relationships because you were focused on your ministry, that was seen as a good thing. But that's the sort of person that Qoheleth is saying, your life is hell. Why are you depriving yourself of good things if you have no one to share them with once you can obtain them? Brown in the Interpretation Bible Commentary sees a connection there to the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh laments, "For what purpose have my arms grown weary? For what purpose was the blood inside me so red? I didn't gain an advantage for myself." This is, the toiler has only himself or herself to blame. See, other people help us to relax and enjoy life. Two people do better at a task than one. Some of us are perfectionist loners who prefer to work in isolation. That's me. I was an only child. I did things by myself. And, when I got to college and I saw people doing study groups, I guess it helps to know I was also homeschooled. So I really learned to work on my own. And when I get to college and I see these people doing study groups together, I tried it once and I'm like, no, I absolutely cannot do this. This slows down my process so much. That's just the way I am. Some people are like that. Some people don't understand people like me, and that's okay. I don't understand people like you either. Just kidding. Mostly. Again, Qoheleth is singling out people who kind of have the mindset that comes naturally to me. It says, yes, you might be able to increase the quality and speed of your work if you do it by yourself, but it also puts so much more stress on you. It's more work in the beginning to find a partner and work with them to get on the same page, but it pays off more in the end. This is kind of the plot of so many different movies, right? Where you have the loner hero who doesn't like working with anyone, and he finds out by the end of it that he actually needs the power of friendship to beat the bad guy or solve the mystery or whatever it is that he has to do. It's so common because it's common to us as humans. We sometimes isolate when really we need the input, the help of other people. Some people look at the illustration in verse 11 and they assume it's talking about a married couple. They see some sexuality in that. If two lie together, they have heat, but how can a person be warm alone? But that's not likely sexual. In the ancient world, it was common to share a bedroom area with multiple people, both for warmth and also just because most houses weren't that big. Despite common practice among early Christians, these verses are not appropriate to read at a wedding, unless you're an advocate of polygamy. Why do I say that? Because while these do extol the benefits of having a partner, the very next verse says that 2 are better than 1, 3 are better than 2. So unless you have a polyamorous friend with whom you're willing to get into a mess of trouble, I don't recommend using this verse to refer to marriage. The analogy kind of breaks down. Although it probably would have fit in the ancient world when they were a little more okay with polygamy than we are today. In verse 12, Qoheleth is likely drawing on an ancient proverb because a very similar statement was found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which reads, "The towed boat will not sink, and a tow rope of 3 strands will not be cut." Commentators also sometimes point to the Iliad as having a connection here. In that work, Homer writes, "They all held their peace, but Diomedes of the loud war cry spoke, saying, 'Nestor, gladly will I visit the host of the Trojans over against us, but if another will go with me, I shall do so in greater confidence and comfort. When 2 men are together, one of them may see some opportunity which the other has not caught sight of. If a man is alone, he is less full of resource, and his wit is weaker." End of quote. I think it's worth noting, though, before we move on, that there are many groups, particularly religious ones, but not exclusively, that proclaim the value of community in an attempt to keep their members inside their own community. Community is profitable, but rigid adherence to any one community is a fast track to creating a cult. This verse should never be used to guilt someone into staying in a harmful or toxic environment. It should drive us to find and join endeavors that we personally find meaningful and aligned with our goals, even if not entirely in methodology or belief, but is absolutely not saying that you can't ever outgrow a group or have multiple groups of varying interests. Qoheleth ends this section with an illustration that is admittedly extremely difficult to translate into English and even to understand in Hebrew. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read to you the King James of it here, and then we'll talk a little bit about this and how it applies with what we've already read. Beginning in verse 13, it says, "Better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king, who will no more be admonished. Because out of prison he came to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becomes poor. I considered all the living that walk under the sun, with the second child that will stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all them that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this is hevel and vexation of spirit." Totally understood every word of that, right? Well, it doesn't really get any easier if we're going off of Hebrew. Let me read you my own literal translation of this, and you'll see why it's so difficult. Literally, these verses read, "Because he came from the prison house to reign, because his kingdom also gives birth to poor ones. I saw all the living walking under the sun with the second child who will stand in his place. There is no end to all the people, to all which have come before them. Those who follow after won't appreciate him either, because this is also hevel and exhaustion of spirit." So it's really hard to translate these verses. But the general idea is that experience doesn't outrank everything. Particularly in an ancient Near Eastern patriarchal culture, it would be common to give extreme respect and deference to someone solely by their age. It's the idea that with age comes wisdom. And that's even still present in our culture today. Now, I am all for respecting elders and seeking the advice of those who have gone before us. However, just because someone was born before you does not automatically make them smarter or wiser or worth listening to. There are plenty of old fools out there, just like there are plenty of young fools out there. There are plenty of wise older people, just like there are plenty of wise younger people. See, age does not determine the validity of a person's statements. We have to actually consider what they are saying, not just their position. Sure, the young don't have the same life experience that older people do, but they can bring a fresh set of eyes. Too many years can also bring too much cynicism. The young view life with a sense of wonder because they are still experiencing it. They are still learning it for the first time. They haven't had all of the negative experiences that sometimes the older folk have. So age does not inherently bring wisdom nor demand respect. A person's position does not automatically mean that they are worthy of respect. I know this is a little controversial, but the way America used to be, we used to assume just because someone wore a police badge or a minister's frock or spoke behind a pulpit or wore a suit as a CEO or, fill in the blank with whatever, they were worth listening to because of their status. And what we've started to realize as a culture is that the position does not make the person reliable or honest or trustworthy. There have been police officers who have misused their power. There have been priests and ministers and pastors who have abused their spiritual authority. Respect has to be earned, not just assumed because of your position or age. And again, I'm not advocating that we be rude to people. You should be just as respectful and friendly and nice to an older person as you are to somebody your own age, and as you are to someone younger than you, dare I even say. See, Qoheleth is taking the trope of an old wise king and flipping it on its head and saying that the king is actually the foolish one and the youth is the wise one. Why? Because the king will no longer be corrected. He won't be admonished anymore. He is so set in his ways that he thinks he has the one right way to do everything, and he will no longer listen to newer perspectives. Now, today we might put it as better is a small and helpful Bible podcast than a pastor who demands to have his way and only preach one perspective. Whatever your age, we need to realize that we need the input of others. Now, even though this Hebrew word melech does mean king, Shapiro adapted his translation to say financier. He reasons, given the previous verses, I suspect Qoheleth isn't talking about the politically powerful, but the financially so. It's a very interesting perspective that I have not found anyone else who agrees with him on that, but it is a unique take. Ultimately, the rest of this story is about this old, foolish king who was once a young man himself and had a riches to rags story, but now the whole nation flocks around this new younger ruler in a vain attempt to gain his favor and see him benefit them. Now, there are some translators who think that there's actually a third person here, so they talk about the old and foolish king, the wise young youth, but then the wise young youth becomes an old foolish king himself, and then another youth takes over after him. And they get this out of verse 15, where it says a second child will stand up in his stead, so they assume that this is a second young ruler, once the first young ruler is now an old ruler. You see why this gets a little bit confusing in the translation? No matter which way you go with it, whether you think that it's just the old foolish king and the wise young king, or if you think that the wise young king later becomes a foolish old king and there's a third king that comes up, the point is that fame and power are useless, like chasing the wind. That's how the New Century Version puts it. Many followed the young king at first, but later they didn't like him either. You can grow your company or your business, your church, your brand as far as you want it to go, but that fame and power will be useless the second you die, and honestly, probably even before then. Some commentators have actually tried to identify the individuals in this illustration as specific historical figures, some of them linking to the story of Joseph and the Pharaoh, others talking about Solomon and his own sons, but this approach is futile. Qoheleth may very well have had a specific example in mind, but we can't know that for sure. Amusingly, according to John Jarrick, this is in the Uncut, New International Commentary on the Old Testament, they point out that Ambrose, an early Christian writer, saw Christ as the one who lifts up his companion from verse 10, warms him in verse 11, and the one who went from the house of the bondsman to be king in verse 13. Furthermore, Jerome, another early Christian writer, had also seen the Trinity in Qoheleth saying concerning the threefold cord. Another common interpretation in early Christianity, writes Uncut, was to identify the three chords as faith, hope, and love. I got a kick out of that. Sometimes these spiritualized interpretations get a little wacky, and those are pretty good illustrations of it. Honestly, that's the kind of thing you might hear preached in some churches, like when a passage just gets too difficult to understand, the preachers default to finding Jesus in there. And I'm not going to say that is always 100% inappropriate. I mean, the New Testament writers did it too, but I prefer to focus on what was the actual original intent of the passage. And Qoheleth definitely did not have the Trinity or Jesus in view when he was writing this. Chapter 4 in the Hebrew text actually includes the very next verse. What we have is chapter 5, verse 1 in English. And then chapter 5 in Hebrew begins with our verse 2. But this is a case where I think the English division actually makes more sense because our next verse fits really well with the rest of chapter 5. So I'm going to just keep the English division here, and we will just address the next verse with the rest of the following verses in their context next week. Next week, as we go into chapter 5, Qoheleth is going to revisit in further detail the topics of our relationship before an all-controlling God, the universality of abuse, and the temporary gift of money. So by now he's kind of laid the groundwork for every topic that he's going to address, and he's going to start going back into them in further detail. Remember as well that we have a question and response episode coming up soon here. We should already have some posts on our socials notifying you of that. So write in, let us know if you have any questions about our Ecclesiastes series so far, or something that you'd like us to address in the future with it. You can write in on our website. You can email us at ccon@thebibleuncut.com. That's CCONN at thebibleuncut.com. You can also comment on our socials, or if you listen on Spotify, there should be an option at the end of the episode for you to write in there as well. Love to hear from you all. I would really like to hear what you think of addressing Qoheleth's views this way. I'm guessing that a lot of what we've talked about is new to you, even if you have grown up in church and been there for decades. This is not the sort of passages that are usually addressed in church. And I realize it can be a little bit shocking. It can be a little bit even upsetting. And we have to wade into that. But I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that Qoheleth does still at the end have a hopeful message here. He's not a total nihilist saying that there is no pleasure or goodness in life. He just wants to question the assumptions we have about how to get to the good life. And he thinks that if he can tear that down, deconstruct what we turn to for happiness, only then can we actually find true happiness. I know it has been a challenge for me, and I actually struggle to fully apply this. So I'm feeling this a little bit harder than anything that we have done so far. I feel like he's calling me out in a lot of this, especially when he talks about the sort of person who just is like a workaholic and doesn't take time to rest and enjoy the slow moments. So is that speaking to you as well? Is there anything else that you are drawing out of this, maybe that I'm missing or not emphasizing enough? I'd love to hear. Let us know. Next week, we'll be going into chapter 5. And until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.